Hello and welcome. These recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam and will go over some of the more common Paper 4 questions. You may find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through as part of your revision. Today we will be looking at the question, had Germany recovered during the golden years? Now, technique is very different for a Paper 4 exam. You have 1 hour and a choice from 2 questions. Normally, one of these will be on the Weimar period and one on the Third Reich. But you have to be aware that you could be asked 2 Weimar questions or 2 Third Reich questions, so you need to revise both topics. It's a proper essay, unlike the Part C Paper 1s you may be used to, in which you have 20 or 25 minutes, so technique should be a little bit more advanced. So, let's get started. Had Germany recovered during the golden years? In answering any Paper 4 question, you should start with an introduction, and your introduction should include DCO. That is to say, define the key terms in the question, give a little bit of context, and outline your scope. For this question, we would define the phrase golden years and place it within the time frame of 1924 to 29, when Gustav Stresemann is at the helm of Germany. In terms of context, remember we don't want much. You might want to mention just some of the problems that had taken place in 1923 back to 1919. So you might want to explain that this period of recovery is in the context of what's happened before it, namely the Treaty of Versailles, left and right-wing revolts, a weak constitution, and also hyperinflation of 1923. To finish the introduction, we will then outline our scope. And the scope of this essay will include the economy, culture, politics, and international standing. For each point, we will argue that yes, there is evidence that shows Germany had recovered, but also no, there is evidence that Germany had not recovered. Point 1, the economy. So, in looking at the factors that suggest Germany had recovered, evidence in the economic field that suggests this was the case include the following. Germany had renegotiated reparations payments through the 1924 Dawes Plan, in which they secured 800 million marks in loans from the USA. Germany was to receive an initial loan of £40 million from the USA, and Germany's reparation payments were rescheduled. In total, Germany received £3,000 million in loans from the USA in the period 1924 to 1930, and experienced a 17% rise in industrial output. Moreover, it introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, which helped put to bed the problems of hyperinflation in 1923. By 1928, German production levels were finally back to pre-war level, and exports were on the increase. Then comes the Young Plan of 1929, whereby the total sum owed by Germany was cut down by a quarter. Annual payments were fixed to run only until 1966, and payment could be deferred for up to 2 years in case of financial difficulty. an international loan of $200 million was made to Germany. So in explaining this point, you could argue that Germany was certainly recovering economically during the golden years. Point 2. Culture. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that these were golden years in terms of culture in the Weimar Republic. Marlene Dietrich made movies in Hollywood and was a big star in movies such as Blonde Venus. Fritz Lang directed epic movies such as Metropolis with its hand-painted sets. The Bauhaus movement came about in architecture, and 15,000 visited the very first Bauhaus exhibition. Clubs in Berlin mushroomed, and cabaret flourished. Indeed, there were 900 dance bands in Berlin alone in 1927. Songs about politics and sex and general freedoms in poetry and writing were starting to be seen. So in explaining point 2, we could argue there is plenty of evidence to suggest that culturally these were golden years for Germany. Point 3. Politics. Evidence that suggests Germany was recovering politically in the years 1924 to 29 include and revolve around the role of Gustav Stresemann. As a right-winger, he had a lot of support, and support from MPs for the Republic increased from 200 to 250 between May 1924 and 1928. The American journalist William Shirer once said, quote, "One scarcely heard of Hitler or the Nazis except as jokes," unquote. So politically, we could argue that Germany was recovering and that we were seeing less of the extremism that we'd seen in the early problems with the Munich Putsch, Kapp Putsch and the Spartacist Rising. Finally, for this side of the argument, we have point 4, international standing. Now, remember, Germany had been treated almost like a child at Versailles, where it was forced to sign and didn't have a say in proceedings. So evidence to support this includes the signing of the Locarno Pact in 1925. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926. The Young Plan came about in 1929, removing foreign troops from the Rhineland. And so in explaining this evidence, you could argue, in terms of international standing, that the golden years marked the onset of Germany becoming an international player once more. Okay, now for the magic words. On the other hand. We will go through the same 4-part scope, but this time we'll pick out evidence that suggests Germany was not recovering in this period. So, point 1, the economy again. Evidence to support this includes: Stresemann once said, quote, "Germany is dancing upon a volcano," unquote, in reference to its loans. Although the value of land in Berlin rose by 700% in the golden years, Germany was dependent on these loans not being quickly called in. In 1928 alone, Germany borrowed 5 billion marks, and even at the height of recovery, unemployment still stood at 1 million. So when the Wall Street crash takes place in 1929, this impacted firstly on the American economy and subsequently on the German economy, due to the links created by the international loans in 1924 and 1929. America gave Germany 90 days to repay these loans. No other power had the money to help. Companies went bankrupt and workers were laid off in millions. The unemployment rate went from 650,000 to 3 million in 2 years. The Depression revived violent and unstable politics and sparked riots and disillusionment with the government. This helped the Nazi Party as the German public turned to more extremist political parties, and in the general election of 1930, the Nazis won 107 seats. So in explaining this point, we could link back to our earlier comment on the economy and say that although Germany did appear to be recovering, this was built on unsteady foundations. Point 2. Culture. Now again, we've argued in the first part of our essay that culturally, Germany was experiencing a bout of real change and success, and that these were exciting times. However, evidence to go against this includes: some saw the decadence of Weimar culture, such as jazz, as signs of a moral decline. There were organisations such as the Wandervogel, which sought a more wholesome, earthy culture. Moreover, the Nazis introduced the idea of Volksgemeinschaft, and this natural organic community held appeal for many who didn't like the changes in Weimar society that were taking place. And so in explaining this point, you could argue that whilst Germany was recovering in terms of culture, that there was also a counter group to this who didn't perceive it as golden. Point 3. Politics. Again, we've argued earlier that as a right-winger, Stresemann had the support of MPs. However, we should also consider the evidence to the counter, which is that the Nazis and Communists were building up their organisations. Even during these stable years, there were 4 different chancellors, and 30% of the vote regularly went to parties opposed to the Republic. Hindenburg was elected president in 1926, and he was opposed to democracy. He even wrote to the Kaiser in exile for approval before he took up the post. And so in explaining this point, you may argue that politically things appeared to be rosy for the Weimar Republic, but that there was this latent extremism bubbling under the surface, just waiting for an opportunity to come out. And finally, point 4. We've argued there were several successes for Stresemann in his foreign policy, but there is some evidence to counter it. Many nationalists saw the signing of Locarno and the joining of the League as an acceptance of Versailles, and this fueled some of the rhetoric that people like Hitler were making. And so in explaining this point, you may argue that in terms of foreign policy there is a counter-argument to suggest that things were not so golden. So to recap, we have given an 8-part scope, 4 points suggesting that Germany was golden, and 4 points suggesting that this period was not a period of golden years. We have looked at the economy, culture, politics, and international standing. And so now it's time for us to round off this paper 4 response by giving a clever conclusion. Gustav Stresemann had steered the German ship into steadier waters through his guile and management. But he was correct when he declared Germany was dancing on a volcano. Despite the many improvements we've spoken about in economy, culture, politics, and foreign policy, major concerns remained in these areas, and they were to erupt in 1929. It is argued here that the problems faced were too great to overcome. They were like a millstone around its neck from the beginning, and that born out of defeat and with little backing and huge economic problems, it's not surprising that the noble experiment didn't work, although this period shows how important the role of economics is in bringing about the decline and end of the golden years. So in short, had Germany recovered during the golden years? Yes, in 4 clear respects, but that there were hidden, latent dangers lurking in the shadows. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye.